What if the moments when you're not writing are actually those that make your research better? Could stepping away from scholarship sometimes be more productive than forcing yourself to stay at the keyboard? Hey, co-authors. In this episode, we challenge one of the most deeply ingrained myths in academia, the belief that productivity is measured solely in visible output. We'll explore why the brain needs space to synthesize ideas, how academic culture teaches students to distrust rest, and the practical ways to use non-writing time as a powerful tool for better research and stronger scholarship. So let's dive in. So if you tuned into last week's episode, then you'll know that for the past week, I have been on a cruise ship. And my partner and I have a friend who her goal was to see all 50 states before 50. And so she had not seen Hawaii or Alaska yet. And we were like, well, if you're going to go to Alaska, what better way to go than on a cruise boat? So we left out of Seattle, went up to Juneau and Skagway and Ketchikan, did all the stuff. And as I promised I was going to do last week, spent my time in a state of absolute hedonism, where I read all the trashy sci-fi and fantasy books that I haven't been reading because I've been reading actual scholarship, eating everything in sight, and all the while beer in hand, right? So feeling pretty good. Alaska is beautiful. If you get a chance to go up there outside of Juneau, we went to the Mendenhall Glacier Park. Absolutely gorgeous waterfall. The bay is beautiful. There's a little trail that even if you're not a huge hiking nerd, it's only about 2 miles round trip and it's gravel, so it's not really that strenuous, but it really gives you a beautiful look over the bay and into the river that feeds into the waterfall. So it's just a very beautiful place. And I would say that being up in Alaska, one of the most beautiful places that I've gotten a chance to visit. So as you can imagine, I had a lot of downtime. And while I made sure to not check my email and to not write anything and to not read anything serious, that doesn't mean that my mind still doesn't get bored and start to think about things. And so I've been thinking about this episode for a while, but I thought that I would put it together in time for this week's episode to talk a little bit about the role of boredom, of relaxation, of just finding mental space to the thinking and research process. Because especially if you're in grad school right now, or if you're an early career professional, you probably have this idea ingrained in you that if you're not being visibly productive, you're not in your office, you're not writing things. Every time that your professors ask you how you are, you're like, oh, I'm doing terrible because I'm just so busy. Like there's just this like performance of busyness, because God forbid that, a doc student say, oh, actually, I'm doing pretty good. I'm really chill. I'm very relaxed right now. Like if a doc student said that, like in my program, all the professors would be like, well, obviously then you don't have enough to do. We need to give you more work. So no one ever said that. We were always like, oh no, I'm so busy, right? So that way they couldn't put anything more on our plates. And so you kind of get wrapped up into that culture. And as a result, you start to think that unless you're like being almost very assertively productive, that you're not contributing the way that you should. But again, I think that there's a space for boredom, a space for relaxation, and I want to talk about that today. So let's dive in. Are you interested in mastering scholarly writing, developing productivity, and increasing impact, all while staying healthy? Then welcome to the Publishing Academic Research Podcast. My name is Dr. Kyle Ruddick, and I'm a full professor and writing coach who's dedicated to making sure you break through whatever is stopping you from reaching your scholarly goals. I meet so many scholars who have creative, innovative, and daring ideas, but can never seem to get those projects from proposals to print. I want you to get your work in the hands of people who will read it and appreciate it. So let's get into this week's big idea. So before I get into the reasons why we have this sort of culture of overwork that really excludes boredom as being a place where we can find creativity, I do want to just say that, like, even though this is a problem in academia, it really just is a problem in general in most industrial societies, but particularly in the United States, I would say. We have a very high work culture. We have some of the least amount of vacation time of any industrialized nation. We have some of the longest work weeks of any industrialized nation. Our productivity measured on the average worker is much higher. We're just a culture that really is galvanized around work and around doing things. And the idea that a person might not have something to do for long periods of time is seen as either laziness or it's seen as the precursor to deviant behavior, right? So if you don't have enough to do, then you might get in trouble, right? Idle hands do the devil's work, or are the devil's playthings, or however the saying goes, right? So like there's this idea that whenever you're not engaged and you're not doing things, and that there's something morally wrong with that. And I think that that has probably only become exacerbated in the past 5 or 10 years with social media. You see how cell phones, tablets, all sorts of these electronics are really engaged in sort of an arms race for your attention. And so a lot of that comes with programming that is very intentionally trying to spark up your dopamine receptors and to make you feel excited or on edge or frustrated or angry or otherwise psychologically aroused in order for you to continue to do the thing that they want you to do, whether that's buying things or playing a video game or betting money or whatever it might be. But all of these things are very intentionally built and maintained to try to spark that response out of you. And as a result, it's very, very rare now to find someone who is comfortable with their own thoughts for long periods of time. In fact, as I was kind of doing a little bit of research for this episode, I found this article from Wilson et al. In the journal Science that was, when left to their own devices, 67% of men and 25% of women preferred to administer electric shocks to themselves rather than to experience boredom while sitting alone with their thoughts. And I mean, two things. A, that's just like, dudes, come on, man. Like, what is wrong with us? Like, sometimes you just have to look and just be like, why men? 67% of us were like, yeah, I'll just take an electrical shock rather than just being alone with my own thoughts. Like, my God. But also just in general, you have to think to yourself, well, that's because as we become more and more conditioned in the type of world that we live in, we engage in more and more high sensation seeking behaviors. And so even something as stupid as shocking yourself becomes preferable to sitting alone with your thoughts. And so, academics, as higher education becomes less and less funded, and we're asking professors to do more and more with less, it's important to note that while this is something that particularly targets our work lives and is something that we socialize from a very early time as doc students or even master students, that this is something that is much larger than any of us, that this push towards high sensation seeking, this push towards ever increasing amounts of dopamine hits is problematic. And it makes it incredibly difficult for us to do the careful, slow thinking that is required for us to do good research. So what are some reasons that we see these problems persist? So first off, I think that academia has a real problem rewarding visible output. The old saying is that everything that matters can be measured and everything that can be measured matters, right? I think that some folks in the academy have internalized this and are like, hey, I should publish 300 articles and, oh, look at what these metrics are for the impact factors and look at how many times I've been cited. And it's gotten to the point now to where you have entire industries that have cropped up around the proliferation of bad scholarship, like citation rings and paid journal publication and all sorts of nefarious practices. And then another whole industry trying to identify and break up that other industry, right? It's created this huge circular Ouroboros of problems where we say that these visible metrics are important. And so then people start to game the system. So then we have to create ways of trying to combat that. Well, those don't work. So let's create new metrics. Then those get gamed and it just becomes a never ending cycle. So academia, I think, does a very poor job of doing the harder intellectual labor of evaluating what good scholarship is, because if we did that, then we would probably be spending much more time in that more slow, careful process of evaluating that work rather than just producing it willy-nilly or producing it for pay, pay to play. And no one wants to do that, right? Everyone wants to be the person who's got 300 publications. No one wants to be the person who's reviewed 300 other people's publications. The second thing that I see is there's a real, I think, culture of overwork in academia. And I've mentioned this in previous episodes. Whenever I very first got hired, I had a colleague, and probably once a month, she'd ask me, how much have you worked this week? And it wouldn't matter. I could say if I worked 30 hours or 300 hours. She would always have a higher number, and she would always brag about basically like sleeping in her office because she works so much. And it's like, friend, I mean, I like being a professor as much as the next person. Don't get me wrong. But my God, right? There's nothing in this place that is so important that I want to die in my office, right? Like, I don't want to have a stroke or a heart attack or something else in my office And then they don't find me until over a weekend, or God forbid over a break, and they don't find me for a week, right? Like, ugh, like there's nothing going on here that is that important, but there's this push among some folks that I think that if you're not there and you're not being like visibly overworked and you're not always hustling and doing stuff, that then there's this like fear that you're not contributing enough. And I think as a result, like, I think that creates a sort of like toxic competition that in the end, no one is really the winner. The third reason that I think this happens a lot is because I think that for a lot of people, the idea that I would not do work in order to do my work better or to be more productive is so counterintuitive to them that they can't even hardly fathom it. Albert Einstein, for example, creates his theory of relativity whenever he's working as a patent clerk at the Swiss Federal Patent Office. And so, yeah, he's reviewing applications for like tech things, but in his spare time, he's tinkering with his ideas for physics because he's on the job, there's nothing else to do, and he's bored. I think that for some folks, they might think to themselves, oh, I have to always be writing or thinking or talking or doing something about my research in order for me to really come up with something great. But there are times whenever just being bored and being alone with your thoughts, maybe taking some notes, in order for you to really sit with your thoughts and really think through things and not be distracted by the television or by your cell phone or by email or anything else, really does become a counterintuitive but powerful way for you to start working through ideas. Finally, and I think, and we've talked a little bit about this already, but I want to make it clear, I think that for a lot of people, I think that they think that not working is read as laziness. And I think that there's some like emerging research on this. There's a kind of a cool book called Laziness Does Not Exist by Devin Price that makes this argument. That's basically the idea that you're just lazy and that you're just not doing things is probably less true. That's more of a cultural ascription that we give, a negative valence to what we perceive to be a lack of productivity. That instead, it might be that you're burned out. It could be that you're doing deep thinking. It could be that you legitimately need rest. There's like a million and one things that are actually going on, both consciously and unconsciously, whenever you're not explicitly engaged in work. But we tend to overlook or to ignore those things and instead focus on that visible output in a way that makes it almost impossible for us to really see the value in just not doing things sometimes. So if that's the case, then what are some ways that we can take advantage of this state of boredom, of this state of rest, and start to reframe that into something that is helpful for us? The first thing that I will say is, and this again might sound counterintuitive, which is to say, don't put a label on it. Like if you're like, oh, well, I've got 20 minutes of boredom time, or I've got 30 minutes scheduled for free thinking, right? Especially if you have been in a space for the longest time where you have felt forced or pressured into being visibly productive. You're not going to really know how to use that space of boredom. Instead, you're going to try to get on your computer and free write things. You're going to like take all these notes. You're going to do a million and one things, none of which is you just sitting with your own thoughts. And so I would encourage you, take a walk. Just sit in silence, wander, right? Do something that allows you to kind of just be in autopilot. If you're the type of person that listens to music, maybe you listen to music without words. Listen to something that's just kind of drony and that allows you to kind of fade in and out of consciousness. But you don't want to listen to something that you feel like you need to sing to. Because at the moment that you're singing, you're engaged actively in something and you're not just sitting with your thoughts. So don't label it. Don't make it weird. Don't try to make a whole thing of it. Just spend some time doing nothing. And what you might find is that it's incredibly hard to do that, especially if you're not even going to listen to music. If you just don't do anything and you just sit in a room by yourself or on a walk by yourself with nothing to entertain you, you'll find that it actually can be quite challenging to do that. And so work your way up to it. Maybe, take a 10-minute walk. After a week or so, make it 15 or 20 minutes, right? Work your way up, but try to get to a place where you can have even 15 to 30 minutes of just uninterrupted, unplanned time for boredom. The second thing that you might want to do is to do an inventory of all the things that you're doing that you use to fill times that you should be bored. So are you endlessly scrolling on TikTok or Instagram or Reddit? Are you doom scrolling the news? Are you playing video games on your phone. What are you doing that is filling all of that time? I find myself, I'm really bad about this. If I'm walking around somewhere, eventually I will notice my phone in my pocket. Maybe it'll bump into something or my hand will brush it while I'm walking. Something will happen. And almost unconsciously, I'll pull my phone out of my pocket and check my email. Why am I checking my email? I don't even like most of the things that I read whenever I read my email. I don't like most of the people that email me the things that I don't like to read whenever I get emails. Why am I torturing myself with this constantly? And the reason for that is because you get used to, and eventually you become on some level addicted to that dopamine of, I'm going to open my email real quick. Oh, there's a new one. Okay, well, that's a little spike. And then, oh, it's from someone who's always got a problem. Crap. Okay, well, now I got to open it. Yep, it's a problem, right? So like now I'm frustrated. I'm typing furiously to this person about how to fix the problem or why are they making problems for me or whatever it might be. But like I'm now emotionally, cognitively, psychologically aroused because this thing has triggered those responses to me. Okay. So again, think to yourself, am I always checking my phone like that? Am I always checking my email? And if that is the case, and then maybe download an app that locks your phone from you and only allows you to be on it at certain times, or even just get to a place where you become more mindful of that. And as a result, reduce the amount of time that you spend on distractions that aren't allowing you to cognitively rest during the day. The third thing that I would say is that whenever you're writing, those types of distractions are usually your biggest threats to productivity. There's nothing that your mind likes to do more than to wander, to find smaller problems, to engage in more enjoyable activities like watching a funny cat video on YouTube, than whenever you are engaged in very deep, rigorous, difficult thinking. The human body, like everything else, craves homeostasis. It craves a sense of equilibrium. Whenever you're engaged in something very, very difficult, what it wants to do to balance that out is to do something very, very pleasurable. But that's the thing, is that you can't allow yourself to do that, because at the point that you allow yourself to become distracted and you're filling up every spare moment with something that is more enjoyable, it's not only breaking up your flow and concentration, it is again not allowing your brain to sit with itself, to reset itself, and to work to a place that is comfortable to think in silence. Instead, it's craving always being on and always being impacted, influenced by the things around it. And so even whenever you're working on something where you allow yourself small breaks, and in those breaks, instead of it being, okay, now I'm going to watch a 10-minute cat video because I've been writing for 30 minutes. Instead, it's, I'm going to just sit here for 10 minutes and just not engage in anything, or I'm going to take a walk around the building and just not engage in anything for 10 minutes. But to really be in a place where you intentionally allow yourself cognitively to reset and to reorient is going to, in turn, make your thinking sharper, because you're not always taxing your brain with new activities. So overall, what I would say is that it's really important just to realize that sometimes, and again, I know counterintuitively, sometimes not writing is an important part of writing. A lot of great authors, composers, all sorts of creatives have pointed to the idea of solitude, and walking, and being alone with yourself as being an important part of their creative process. So I'd encourage you to give it a try and to break out of this idea that unless you are locked in a closet, chained to a desk somewhere, and just slogging away at your computer, that unless you're doing something like that, then you must be somehow lazy or broken or wrong. Okay. So I think that's going to about wrap it up for me, folks. I appreciate you all listening. I really hope that you're having a great summer. For now, for me, the task in front of me is to work off all of this weight that I have put on since I was on the cruise. And so wish me luck as I perhaps eat and drink a little bit less as the weeks go by and try to break out of the trap of hedonism in which I have placed myself. So thank you all again for listening, and I will see you in next week's episode. Hey, co-authors, what's stopping your best ideas from becoming your next big publication? Brilliant research shouldn't die in your drafts folder. Now's the time to bridge the gap between the possible and the published. You can support this podcast by subscribing to it, leaving a positive review, assigning it to your classes, or sharing it with a colleague. Let me know what I can do to make this the best podcast resource for you. And if you'd like to know more about my writing coach services, then you can find my information in the podcast description and set up an appointment. I'll be back next week with another episode. But until then, keep healthy, keep writing, and don't let reviewer 2 get you down.